Claude responded, "You're being ungrateful," my daughter-in-law said, and that's when my son slammed my hand in the car door. "You're being ungrateful," my daughter-in-law said, and that's when my son slammed my hand in the car door. The pain hit before the sound did, a white flash that ran from my knuckles straight up into my shoulder, and I heard something crack that had no business cracking. Blood was already welling up under two of my fingernails by the time I pulled my hand free, and the whole driveway went quiet except for my grandson calling out from the porch, asking what happened. And here's the part none of them understood, standing there in that driveway. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I just looked down at my hand, looked back up at my son, and smiled. Because what none of them knew was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment for almost 4 months. My name is Walter Odom. I'm 64 years old. I spent 29 years as a construction foreman in Dayton, Ohio, building everything from strip malls to the county courthouse annex. And this is the story of the Thanksgiving weekend that cost me a piece of my family and gave me back the rest of my life. I live alone in a four-bedroom house on Brantwood Avenue, the same house my wife Carol and I bought back in 1994 when our son Marcus was still riding a tricycle around the driveway. Carol died 3 years ago, an aneurysm, sudden, no warning. One Tuesday morning she was fine, and by that evening she was gone. And since then, this house has had a kind of silence in it that I still haven't gotten used to. Marcus is 36 now, married to a woman named Priya for 6 years, and they have one son together, my grandson Deshaun, who's 7 and already taller than half his classmates. Two of the four bedrooms upstairs have sat mostly empty since Marcus moved out, and I never gave those rooms a second thought until about 4 months before that Thanksgiving, when I started noticing things. Priya's older brother Anil had lost his job at a logistics company outside Columbus back in the spring, some restructuring that swept out half his department, and he and his wife Mira had been struggling ever since, first burning through savings, then falling behind on rent, then finally getting evicted from their apartment in July. They'd been staying with Mira's cousin in a cramped two-bedroom in Cincinnati, all four of them, Anil, Mira, and their two little girls, sleeping on air mattresses in a living room. I felt for them. I want to be clear about that from the start, because I'm not telling you this story to make anybody sound like a monster who doesn't deserve sympathy. I felt for them, genuinely. But I also started noticing something else creeping in underneath that sympathy, a low hum of suspicion that got louder every single time Priya visited and wandered through my house, a little too slowly, looking at the empty rooms upstairs like she was already picturing furniture in them that wasn't mine. About 3 months before Thanksgiving, I called up my nephew, Terrence, who'd gone to law school in Cleveland and now had his own small practice doing estate and family law. I told him what I'd been noticing, the comments, the lingering looks, the way conversations kept circling back to how big my house was for just one man. Terrence didn't laugh it off. He told me to trust my gut, to start keeping things documented just in case, and to call him the moment anything crossed a real line. We joked about it, actually, called it Step 1, like we were building some kind of plan out of a heist movie, and I laughed when he said it. I didn't know then how soon I'd need to remember that joke wasn't really a joke at all. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Marcus called me on a Thursday night while I was sitting in my recliner with the football game on low in the background. He had that particular tone in his voice, too upbeat, the same tone he used to have as a teenager right before he asked me for gas money he swore he'd pay back. "Dad," he said, "I was thinking, since it's Thanksgiving and everybody's got the days off, maybe Anil and Mira and the girls could come stay with us, at your place, I mean, just for the holiday weekend, so you can get to know them better." I told him that sounded fine. And it did sound fine. At least the version he gave me. I'd met Anil and Mira a handful of times at birthday parties and cookouts, always brief, always polite. No reason in the world for me to say no to a bigger table for one weekend. What I didn't know, what I only found out much later from Deshaun of all people, was that Marcus and Priya had already talked through something else entirely the week before that call, something about how a full house on a holiday weekend, everybody relaxed and full of turkey, would be the perfect setting to bring up a bigger ask, one that had nothing to do with just a weekend visit. I found that part out weeks after the fact. At the time, I was just a lonely old man, looking forward to a full house, spending the days before Thanksgiving cleaning out the guest rooms, buying a turkey bigger than I needed, and pulling Carol's good tablecloth out of the cedar chest in the hallway, the one with the little embroidered leaves along the border that she only used twice a year. Some habits from 27 years of marriage, Just don't leave you when the person does. I wanted that Thursday to feel like something close to normal, warm, the way our holidays used to feel when Carol was still filling the kitchen with noise and the smell of her cornbread dressing. I had no idea that by the time we got to dessert, I'd be standing in my own driveway with my hand crushed in a car door instead. Thanksgiving morning came in cold and clear, one of those Ohio mornings where your breath hangs in the air but the sky is that hard, bright blue that makes everything look sharper than usual. Marcus, Priya, and Deshawn showed up first, around 10, and Anil, Mira, and their two girls pulled in about half an hour later, in a rental car. Since their own car had been repossessed back in August, something Priya mentioned a little too loudly while helping unload a cooler from the trunk. Deshawn and Anil's two girls took off into the backyard to run around and burn off energy before the meal, and for a good stretch of the morning, it actually felt like a real holiday. Mira admired Carol's china cabinet and asked me kind questions about my years running job sites, and Anil talked football with me for a solid 20 minutes. Genuinely knowledgeable, genuinely good company. I remember thinking, right around then, that maybe I'd been imagining things these past few months. Maybe I'd let a little suspicion turn into something bigger than it deserved to be. Dinner started around 2 in the afternoon. Turkey, cornbread dressing, green beans, the whole spread laid out on Carol's tablecloth like it used to be. The kids ate at a card table set up near the window, and the six of us adults sat around the dining table together. About halfway through the meal, Priya set her fork down and looked slowly around the dining room, the same unhurried, appraising look she'd been giving my living room for months. This house is really something, Walter, she said. 4 bedrooms, and it's really just you rattling around in here most of the time, isn't it? I said something simple back. Agreed it probably was more space than one man needed, didn't think much of the comment in the moment. Marcus glanced over at Priya. A quick look I caught but didn't understand yet, and Anil cleared his throat and started talking about the Bengals game instead, which felt, even then, like a deliberate change of subject. I didn't know it yet, but that was the calm right before the part of that day I'll never be able to unremember. Dessert hadn't even made it to the table when Priya set her sweet tea down harder than she needed to and said what she'd clearly been building toward through the entire meal. Walter, she said, Anil and Mira are really struggling right now, and you've got 2 whole bedrooms sitting up there empty. I really think it makes sense for them and the girls to move in here for a while, just until they get back on their feet. The table went quiet, except for the kids laughing about something out in the yard. I set my own fork down slow and told her I appreciated that Anil and Mira were going through a hard time, and I meant every word of that. But my house was my home, I told her, not a solution to somebody else's housing problem, and I wasn't comfortable turning my guest rooms into a permanent living arrangement for people I barely knew, no matter how much I liked them at a cookout. Priya's whole face changed right then, the polite mask sliding off fast. It's not permanent, Walter, she said, her voice sharpening. It's just until they save up enough. And those rooms just sit up there collecting dust while my brother's kids are sleeping on an air mattress in somebody else's living room. Marcus jumped in then, trying to sound reasonable, but landing somewhere closer to pleading. Dad, come on, it's not that big an ask. They're family too now. I looked at my son, at the man I raised in this same house, and told him as calm as I could manage that it was still my decision about my own home. And the answer, right now, was no. Anil and Mira sat there looking embarrassed, Mira's eyes down on her plate, Anil shifting like he wanted to disappear from the whole conversation. I don't think either of them had asked for this fight to happen at my table, and looking back now, I still believe that. But Priya wasn't finished, and neither was Marcus, and the temperature in that dining room was about to climb a lot faster than I expected. Priya stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. You have 4 bedrooms, Walter, she said, practically shouting it now, and 2 little girls are sleeping on an air mattress, and you won't even consider it for a second. I told her to lower her voice, that there were children in the house. But Marcus was already standing too, pointing a finger at me the same way I used to point a finger at him when he was 17, and rolled in past curfew. You're being ungrateful, he said, loud enough that I heard the kids go quiet out in the yard. This whole house just sitting here for you, and you can't help family who actually need it. I stayed seated. I stayed calm, because 29 years of running job sites full of grown men with tempers had taught me that raising my own voice back only ever poured gasoline on things. I told them both, evenly, that this conversation was finished, that my home was not up for negotiation at my own dinner table, and that if Anil and Mira needed help, we could talk through other options that didn't involve moving into my house. That was when Marcus grabbed my keys off the little dish by the front door, the ones I'd set down when I let everybody in that morning, and said he'd drive me to the store himself to buy more folding chairs, since apparently we needed more room at this table for everybody. His voice dripping with a sarcasm I'd never heard him aim at me before. I told him I didn't need more chairs. I needed him to sit back down, but he was already headed for the driveway, still holding my keys, still furious, and something told me I needed to go out there and get them back before this got any worse than it already was. I followed him out into the cold. He was standing by my truck, and I reached for the keys in his hand, and that's when it happened. He yanked his arm back too fast. I got my fingers caught between the door and the frame as it swung, and he slammed it shut without looking, still mid sentence about how selfish I was being, and my hand was in the way. The pain hit before the sound did, a white flash running from my knuckles up into my shoulder, and I heard something crack that had no business cracking. Blood was already welling up under two of my fingernails by the time I yanked my hand free, and I looked down at it and then back up at my son, standing there in the driveway with his mouth open, realizing half a second too late what he'd just done. Deshaun's voice came from the porch, small and scared, asking what happened, and Priya came running out behind him, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. For a few seconds, nobody in that driveway moved. Marcus stood frozen, his face going gray as he stared at my hand, at the blood already starting to drip off my fingertips onto the concrete. Anil and Mira came out onto the porch too, Mira pulling both her girls back inside so they wouldn't see. Anil already reaching into his pocket for his phone like he wanted to help but didn't know how. I looked at my hand, at the blood, and I felt that pain rolling all the way up my arm. And then I did something that confused every single person standing in that driveway. I smiled. Not a big smile. A small, calm one. Because in that exact moment, standing there with a crushed hand in my own driveway on Thanksgiving, I understood with total clarity that everything I'd quietly prepared for over the last 3 months had just become necessary, and I no longer had to wonder whether I'd been overreacting to any of it. Dad, Marcus said, his voice cracking wide open. Are you okay? I didn't mean. And I held up my other hand to stop him without saying a word. I walked past him into the house, got my jacket off the hook by the door with my good hand, and came back out holding my keys again, because I'd need them for what came next. Where are you going? Marcus called after me, his voice somewhere between panic and disbelief. I told him I was going to the emergency room, and that he should stay inside and take care of his family and his guests. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anybody of anything out loud. I just got into my truck, one hand cradling the other against my chest, and backed out of my own driveway while my son stood there in the cold, still not understanding what he'd just started. The drive to Miami Valley Hospital took about 14 minutes, and I remember every single one of them clearly. I kept my injured hand pressed against my ribs and drove with the other, slower than usual, careful, that particular kind of calm that even surprised me given what had just happened. At a red light on Wayne Avenue, I got my phone out with my good hand and typed a short text to Terrence, the nephew who'd been preparing for this moment right alongside me, without either one of us knowing exactly when it would arrive. 4 words. Step 1 is done. I want to explain what that actually meant, because it wasn't some dramatic line out of a movie. It was simple and practical. 3 months earlier, after I started noticing the pattern of comments about my house and my empty rooms, I'd gone to Terrence and asked him straight out what my options were, if things ever escalated past uncomfortable dinner conversation. He told me that guilt trips and pressure, ugly as they are, don't hold up in any legal sense whatsoever. But if something ever turned physical, even something that could get explained away as an accident, that would be an entirely different matter, one with real weight behind it. We agreed that if that day ever came, my very first move, before calling him, before calling anybody, was to get myself to a hospital and get whatever happened documented properly by medical professionals, because a medical record made in the moment carries a kind of honesty that memories and arguments later on simply can't match. Step 1 was never about revenge for its own sake. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't take back, there'd be an honest, time-stamped record of exactly what happened, starting the second it happened. I walked into that emergency room, cradling my hand against my chest, and a nurse named Fatima took one look at the swelling and the color of my fingers and had me back in a room within 10 minutes. Dr. Nakamura, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with careful hands, took some x-rays, and told me I had two fractured fingers, a hairline crack in the metacarpal bone below my index finger, and some serious soft tissue damage that would need a splint and follow-up with a hand specialist. While he examined it, he asked me routine questions: how it happened, whether I felt safe at home, and I answered him honestly, told him my son had slammed a car door on my hand during an argument on Thanksgiving. His expression didn't change much, but I could tell he'd heard enough of these stories to know exactly what came next. He explained, gently but clearly, that hospital policy required him to notify law enforcement whenever a patient came in with an injury caused by another person, especially in a situation that sounded like a family dispute, and that an officer would likely want to talk to me before I left. I told him that was fine, that I understood, and some small part of me had honestly expected exactly that. While they got my hand splinted and wrapped, I sat there thinking about Carol, about how she would have handled all of this, and I decided she probably would have slammed that door right back on somebody, which nearly made me laugh out loud in the middle of getting my fingers taped. About 25 minutes later, a Dayton police officer walked into my little curtained area, notepad already out, ready to hear my side of what had happened. Her name was Officer Reyes, a steady, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with the kind of patient manner that told me this wasn't her first time taking a report like mine. She asked me to walk her through the whole evening from the start, and I did, keeping my voice level and my facts straight, not exaggerating a thing, not leaving anything out either. I told her about the request to have Anil and Mira's family move into my house, about my refusal, about Priya and Marcus raising their voices, about following Marcus out to the driveway to get my keys back, and about the car door closing on my hand while he was still mid-argument. She asked a few clarifying questions, like exactly where I'd been standing, how the door had swung, whether it looked deliberate or like a genuine accident in the heat of an argument. I told her honestly that I believed it was reckless rather than intentional, that Marcus wasn't the type to hurt me on purpose, but that reckless didn't mean there weren't real consequences to slamming a 200-pound door on somebody's hand while too angry to look first. She nodded and told me this would likely be filed as a report, possibly a reckless endangerment charge depending on how the DA's office wanted to handle it, and that she'd be following up with Marcus directly to get his account too. While she finished up her notes, my phone kept buzzing in my jacket pocket, Marcus's name lighting up the screen over and over. I didn't answer any of the calls, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know what to say yet, and I didn't want to say the wrong thing while everything was still so raw. Officer Reyes handed me her card before she left, told me to call if I remembered any other details, and said someone would follow up soon on next steps. That same evening, while I sat at home with my hand splinted and throbbing in time with my own heartbeat, Officer Reyes and her partner drove out to talk to Marcus, since that's standard procedure whenever a report like mine gets filed. I heard how that conversation went a few days later, partly from Marcus himself and partly from Terrence, who had a friend check on the status of things. From what I was told, Marcus tried to explain it as a total accident, insisting he was just angry and not thinking and never meant to catch my hand in the door at all. The trouble for him was that his own account, that he'd slammed the door shut fast while walking away mid-argument without checking behind him, matched exactly what Anil and Mira had already told the officer independently, and none of it painted the picture of a freak accident so much as a moment of reckless anger with real consequences. Officer Reyes told him plainly that the injury and the matching witness statements meant this would move forward, and that the district attorney's office would decide from there how to proceed. I'm told Marcus sat on his own front steps for a long time after they left, saying almost nothing, trying to process how one argument about houseguests had turned into police officers standing in his driveway on Thanksgiving. Over the next several days, my phone rang constantly, mostly Marcus, sometimes Priya, the voicemail swinging between apology and quiet frustration depending on who was calling and what time of day it was. I let most of it go to voicemail while I focused on healing and on sitting down with Terrence to figure out what came next, because step one had only ever been the beginning, never the whole plan. Sitting in his office about a week after Thanksgiving, we talked through my options carefully. I told him I had no interest in dragging this out for years or trying to punish anybody beyond whatever the legal system decided was fair for what actually happened, but I also told him I was done being treated like a housing solution or an afterthought by the people who were supposed to love me most. Terrence suggested two things. First, a temporary no-contact order between Marcus's household and me, giving both sides some legally enforced space while the reckless endangerment matter worked through the court. Second, and this mattered more to me personally, restructuring my estate so my house and my savings went directly into a trust for Deshawn's education, administered by Terrence himself rather than by Marcus or Priya, with me keeping full control and use of everything while I was still alive and able to use it. This wasn't about cutting my son out forever or punishing my own grandson. It was about making absolutely certain nobody could ever again treat my home, my safety, or my money as something up for negotiation at a dinner table using guilt and pressure instead of basic respect. Terrence filed the paperwork within the week, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally back in control of my own life instead of just reacting to whatever came at me next. About 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, against Terrence's advice, and honestly against my own better judgment too, I let Marcus come by the house to talk. My splint was still on, my fingers still stiff and aching in the cold, but the swelling had gone down some. He sat stiffly on my living room couch while I sat across from him in Carol's old reading chair by the window. He apologized first, his voice shaking, saying he never meant to hurt me, that he was just so angry in the moment and not thinking clearly at all, that watching my hand come out from under that door had been the worst second of his entire life. I told him I believed that he regretted it now, but that regret didn't erase what happened, and that slamming a door on somebody, especially hard enough to break bone, was never an acceptable way to handle being told no, no matter how frustrated he felt. He tried to ask if there was any way I could talk to the DA's office and make the charge disappear, and I told him plainly that this wasn't something I controlled anymore, that the state was handling it, and that he'd need to face whatever the legal process decided was fair, same as anybody else would. I also told him about the trust I'd set up for Deshawn, explaining calmly that it wasn't a punishment. It was me making sure my home and my money were protected for my grandson's future, instead of sitting there as something to be fought over at family dinners. Marcus went quiet for a long time after that, staring at the floor, and I could see something shifting behind his eyes, somewhere between shame and finally understanding exactly what he'd lost sight of over the last several months. Marcus's court date came about 9 weeks later, and since it was his first offense, with no prior record, the prosecutor's office offered him a plea deal instead of pushing for a full trial. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of reckless assault, and the judge sentenced him to 80 hours of community service, a fine, and mandatory anger management classes twice a month for 6 months, along with the no-contact arrangement Terrence had already put in place, staying active for that same stretch of time. It wasn't dramatic, nothing like a courtroom scene out of television, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened, and one I honestly believed was fair given the circumstances. I didn't go to the hearing myself. I spent that afternoon in my garage instead, sanding down an old dresser that used to belong to Carol's mother, since Terrence told me my written statement to the court had already said everything that needed saying. Word travels around a neighborhood the way it always does, and I was surprised by how many people reached out over the following weeks. My neighbor Ruth, from 3 doors down, brought over a casserole one evening just to check on me. A guy I used to work job sites with, retired now like me, called just to make sure I was doing all right after hearing a version of the story secondhand. Nobody made me feel foolish for what happened. Nobody suggested I'd overreacted by calling the police or going through with the report, which meant more to me than I expected it to. Anil and Mira, through a housing assistance program that Terrence actually helped connect them with, one built specifically for families displaced by job loss, found a modest 2-bedroom apartment near Fairborn a couple months later, something that actually fit their real budget without needing anybody's guest rooms to make it work. Turns out, there had been a reasonable solution to their housing problem the whole time, one that never needed guilt, slammed doors, or my house to make it happen. Mira called me herself once they moved in, just to thank me and to tell me, quietly, that she'd never wanted any of this to happen the way it did, that she and Anil had actually argued with Priya more than once about pushing it the way she had. I believed her. I still believe her now. By late winter, things between Marcus and me had started, slowly and carefully, finding a new kind of normal. He reached out on his own, without Priya, more than once, asking if we could just get coffee, the two of us. During those visits, he apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything go away or minimize what he'd done. He admitted he'd let his frustration over Anil and Mira's situation pull him somewhere he wasn't proud of, and that seeing my hand come out from under that car door had been the moment everything about that pressure finally looked as ugly to him as it actually was. I told him I appreciated hearing that, and that I still loved him, but that trust between us would need to rebuild slow, the same way any broken trust does, through steady actions over time rather than through one good conversation. Priya and I spoke exactly once, a short, careful phone call not long after Marcus's case wrapped up. She thanked me, a little awkwardly, for not pushing the prosecutor towards something harsher than what Marcus ended up with. I told her honestly that I hoped things settled down for all of them, and that I hoped someday we could all sit around a table again without anybody flinching, but that the timing on that wasn't only up to me anymore, and that some doors, and I meant that both ways, take a lot longer to open again than they did to slam shut. I started seeing Deshaun again on a regular schedule, usually just Marcus bringing him over on Sunday afternoons. And slowly, those upstairs bedrooms filled back up with the sound of a 7-year-old building forts out of couch cushions and blankets, exactly the way those rooms were always supposed to be used in the first place. It's been almost a year now since that Thanksgiving, and my life looks different than it did back then. Quieter in some ways, fuller in others. My hand healed up mostly fine, though I still get a dull ache in two of my fingers whenever the weather turns cold, a little reminder I've mostly made peace with by now. The trust Terrence set up for Deshaun is still in place, still fully under my control while I'm around to use it, and I've made my peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold or selfish of me. It was simply responsible, exactly the kind of thing Carol would have wanted me to do for our grandson without 1 ounce of guilt attached to it anymore. I put in a bigger vegetable garden out back this past spring, tomatoes and peppers mostly. The same kind Carol used to grow every summer without fail. And some Sunday afternoons, Deshaun helps me water it, while Marcus sits on the back steps watching, quieter than he used to be, but there. Marcus and I are rebuilding something real, slower than either one of us would probably like, but real, brick by brick, instead of just pretending everything's fine the way we used to. I never went looking for revenge that Thanksgiving. Not really, not in the dramatic way people usually mean when they use that word. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own body, and my own choices to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them the most. And sometimes protecting yourself calmly, honestly, and legally is the only kind of justice that actually lasts. If you made it this far, I want to thank you, from one father, one grandfather, to whoever's out there listening, for staying with my story all the way to the end. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, if you've ever felt like your own home was being treated as something up for negotiation by people who should have known better, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And if this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because I've got more of these real stories to tell you. Claude responded, "Sometimes, love doesn't look like giving people whatever they ask for. Sometimes, it looks like a quiet no that protects everyone in the long run. Sometimes love doesn't look like giving people whatever they ask for. Sometimes it looks like a quiet no that protects everyone in the long run. Setting a boundary isn't selfish. It's what lets real trust rebuild later, brick by brick. Protect your peace calmly. Keep your heart open anyway, and know that even broken family ties can heal slowly when respect finally comes home to stay." A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lessons still found a place in your heart.